Welcome, class. So, last class we discussed the times of the divided Israelite monarchy and the ultimate conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel and the subsequent loss of the 10 tribes of Israel. Now, we now arrive at Judah and the fall of Jerusalem. So now we're going to look at the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. And we're going to look at what happens to this kingdom as we progress towards the eventual fall of the city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the first temple. So, the Davidic monarchy. So, as we said before last class, right, in this period, there really is this emphasis on the idea of an eternal mandate being given to David by God, and that it's always to be the descendants of David that rule. And this really does remain more or less the policy. That being said, there are coups, and coups happen for a number of reasons. First of all, there is the general habit of various coups, various issues wherein if a Davidic monarch is not abiding by the divine law, then rather than overthrowing the whole dynasty like we saw in the north, in northern Israel, in Judah, the policy would be to depose such a king and replace him with a Davidic relative who was more open to the laws of God. However, there's that issue of King Amon, who is one of the kings who came to power via one of these coups. And in the second book of Kings, chapter 21, verses 19 to 26, we get a description of Amon's coup, or the coup involving Amon at that stage. So Judah besieged. What actually happened to Judah that gets it into real hot water? Well, King Pekah of Israel, together with King Rezin of Aram, attacked Judah and lay siege to the city of Jerusalem. Around the same time, the Edomites rise up and reconquer Elath. And we get these details in the Bible. Now, from what we've gathered, what ends up happening is there was a three-nation alliance between the kingdom of Aram, the Edomites, and the kingdom of Israel, all against a common mutual enemy, namely the kingdom of Judah. Now, this may seem odd to us, and it definitely may seem, and I think definitely to the scriptural authors, this struck them as odd. But remember, to us as individuals reading the Bible, we think of these two kingdoms as linked because they are the descendants of the original 12 tribes of Israel. They are, the Jewish people, the Israelite people. And because of their common religion, we naturally think of Judah and Israel as a package deal. So to us, the concept of Israel making an alliance with its pagan neighbors against Judah would definitely strike us as a monstrous betrayal. But these two kingdoms have had rival monarchies for quite an extended period of time, centuries, in fact. And so, in that regard, despite their mutual religion, that wouldn't have necessarily, not all statesmen of the time would have seen this as a particularly grievous breach of loyalty. Remember, as we see nowadays and in much more modern history, Christian nations fight Christian nations all the time. Muslim nations fight Muslim nations all the time. It's not necessarily seen as a monstrous theological problem that they do so. All right, but now Judah finds itself on all three sides being attacked, right? The Edomites to their south, the Aram to their east, and Israel to their north, and they're just getting clobbered. Finally, the king makes a choice. King Ahaz of Judah makes an alliance with King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. And he basically makes a deal and says, hey, we'll make an alliance. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Will you come into the region and assist us in driving out these enemies? And King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria comes into the region. And this is where Assyria really enters the Levant into what we would now consider that general Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian kind of area. This is that region, what's now Israel and Judah, that part of the world, the Holy Land. That's where we get Assyria comes in. And we're going to take a look at what they do. So for the kingdom of Judah, the presence of Assyria in the region is a blessing and a curse. So how is it a blessing? Well, they capture King Aram. They captured this whole kingdom of Aram and killed King Rezin. On the flip side, Judah becomes a vassal of Assyria. So this is not a co-equal alliance. This is not just two kings that happen to have a mutual treaty of alliance. Judah is a vassal, meaning while the king of Judah remains a king, he's allowed to keep the style of king, the title of king, and all the honors due a king. He still owes allegiance. He owes military and political loyalty to the king of Assyria. And that includes not only political and military alliance, but also tribute. He has to pay money, taxes to the Assyrian government. And so from this point onward, Judah is not an independent monarchy. They are a vassal state of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So what happens now? Israel falls. So what happens? Well, first, we have the whole 10 lost tribes, right? The northern 10 tribes are carried off. This is after Israel rebels again against Assyria. They get destroyed and they're carried off. And we never hear from these people really again. Now, in ancient times, in medieval times, some people used to believe that they were still wandering, that the tribes of Reuben and Dan and Manasseh and Ephraim were out there somewhere in the world as nomadic tribes wandering around, and that maybe someday we'd bump into them again. No, that's not the case. More likely than not, they were either entirely massacred, which the Assyrians did do to a lot of people. The Assyrians are one of the few cultures in human history that will brag about their war crimes. If you ever get a chance to see translations of Assyrian inscriptions, they're interesting, but also kind of horrifying, the things the Assyrian kings confess to in their boasting. Like, it's weird. Most pagan cultures, the Bible gives a much harsher critique of them than other ancient sources, or than they give themselves. Assyria is the dead opposite in that regard. For all the bad things the Bible says about the Assyrians, the things the Assyrians confess to themselves are arguably worse. I'm talking like you could be tried by the Hague today for almost anything a typical Assyrian king did, just to give you a sense of scale. All right, let's talk about the 10 lost tribes. What actually happened to them? Those who survived were likely enslaved and either died in Assyrian mines, mining iron and copper, or those who lived likely just simply lost their Israelite Jewish identity and gradually assimilated into the various pagan cultures of the Assyrian Empire. Now, not everybody got swept up in this. Some Israelites, when it became clear the kingdom of Israel had fallen, fled across the border to their nearest neighbor, arriving in the kingdom of Judah. And since they belonged to that same religion, they were able to settle in Judah as refugees. Now, with them, they brought the lowest source, what historians call the Book of E. And it's here that the Yahwist source and the lowest source are first merged into one text, right? This is when we start putting them together. Now, we're not going to get the finished version of what they become together until much later, until the end of the or till middle of the Babylonian exile or so. I say middle, probably more like beginning. Sometime in the Babylonian exile is when we get the finished Pentateuch. But this is already the beginning of those two sources coming together, right? J and E are pretty tightly intertwined, or become more intertwined as this time period rolls on. So Hezekiah, among many of the kings of Judah, few are as well remembered as Hezekiah. You know, of all the kings of the divided monarchy period, he gets a lot of praise. And one of the things that gives Hezekiah his praise is his wall, which is actually become such a famous part of biblical iconography. It still features on Jesse trees around Christmas time to this day. So first, Hezekiah was deeply devoted to God, and he destroyed various idols. Other Judean kings had set up idols and shrines in the area, not only of their own, flirting with paganism, but also to appease their Assyrian overlords. So there were various shrines dedicated to pagan gods in the area around Jerusalem. There were also idols had also been placed in or around the temple itself. And Hezekiah goes and destroys these idols. He also rebels against Assyria. And naturally, the Assyrians rush in with a massive army. And this, now, before we get into that, we're talking about he also conquered the Philistines. The Philistines, who are still on the coast, that had been a problem for years. He subjugates the Philistines once again to Judean rule. Now, the Assyrians don't take all of this lying down. Judah is flexing its independence, and Assyria is having none of it. So they send an invasion force under the command of Sennacherib of Assyria. And what we get during this time period is Hezekiah's wall. Hezekiah knows the Assyrians are coming for him. He isn't paying tribute. He isn't doing, he's rebelling. And he knows the Assyrian army is coming. So he builds a massive wall around the city of Jerusalem. Now, one of the big things that makes Hezekiah's wall so important is, and if we go through to the next page, maybe we'll get a look at this. Yeah. So this is the issue. So one of the things that exists with Judah is outside the city, at the base of the hill, is a well. So what Hezekiah did is there's a shaft there that in the past had been used by Joab back in the day, so as to enter the city, just as with King David back when he conquered the city from the Jebusites. Hezekiah builds a wider wall that surrounds the spring, and builds a tunnel, carves a tunnel through the mountain to drain the spring, this spring of fresh water, into cisterns within the city to keep a supply of fresh water. See, a lot of us, when we imagine ancient battles, we like to think of, the things like you see in movies, these vast armies clashing on the battlefields and arrows flying everywhere and men attacking with swords and spears and all. And yes, there are battles where that happened. But when it came to urban defense, one of the big advantages was walls. See, if you had high enough walls with enough archers, you really could outlast an enemy incursion. Now, when it comes to sieges, yes, when we'd like to talk about sieges, our first instinct is to talk about siege engines, to talk about trebuchets and catapults and battering rams and all that fun stuff. And that's not wrong to think about it. But it's worth remembering that in all reality, the bigger danger in siege was starvation and thirst, right? You can't last longer than a couple of days without water. You can't last longer than a few weeks without food. So, and the thirstier and hungrier the population gets, the more willing they are to contemplate opening the gates in order to end the siege. And for that reason, it's much more important to have a decent food and water supply if you're going to survive a siege. And Hezekiah was no fool. He understood that reality, and that's why he initiated this massive building project in order to ensure that when the Assyrians came, the city of Jerusalem, at the very least, could withstand the Assyrian army. Now, in biblical text, we hear mention of divine intervention in the form of an angel of death bringing an attack on the Assyrian army. And this seems to coincide with the possibility of a plague, a divinely inspired plague. So why does this make sense? Well, so here's the thing to know about army camps. Nowadays, modern armies take a lot of care with the hygiene in their army camps. This isn't just an example of modern military liking discipline. The truth is, this is a hard-learned lesson over millennia. See, ancient army camps were absolute breeding grounds of disease. Poor sanitation, things like that. Quickly, and the large amount of congregated people and food made it a breeding ground for rats, flies, and all other manner of disease-bringing things. And so outbreaks in army camps were not unheard of, especially in periods when an army suddenly found themselves standing still, i.e. during a siege. And now the Assyrians never really mention the siege on Jerusalem, which may be a very good indication of how well it did. The Assyrians, who like to boast about conquering things, deliberately don't mention it in their records, or at least not any records we have. But this would seem to fit with the destruction of the Assyrian army. And this was not an unheard of phenomenon for besieging armies to experience plague outbreaks. So ultimately, Hezekiah and his wall allowed Jerusalem to survive. So another king we got to talk about is King Josiah. So Josiah comes a little while after Hezekiah, and he has some more reforms. He cleanses the temple. He pulls down statues of idols and whatnot, and he clears out the temple. And he also commissions a renovation. He wants the temple to be restored to its former glory, right? The building is getting on in years. So he commissions architects to come in and begin restoring it. While they're restoring it, they discovered a book of the law, a scroll hidden in a compartment somewhere. Now, you may be asking, why on earth would the high priest of the temple be hiding scrolls in the walls? There are a few reasons. Reason number one could have been during a reign of a king that was more pro-pagan, fearing that he might destroy the works. It also very well could have been during earlier siege attempts and other warfare, hiding temple valuables, including scrolls, to make sure they weren't destroyed or stolen during the conquest. Now, he finds this scroll of the law, and all it's identified ever as a scroll of the law. And it's most based on the reforms Josiah later carries out. we're relatively certain it was a Deuteronomist source. So we're about 95% sure as historians that this source is pretty much the book of Deuteronomy, is what they discover here. Now, this leads to a massive religious reform along Deuteronomic lines. For example, one of the big events we see happening is under the rules in Leviticus and Exodus, while you had the central shrine in the central temple in Jerusalem, and this was used for major festivals, a lot of local communities were permitted to maintain their own altars. So they would maintain their own altar for sacrifices and other rituals, and that would be done locally. Beginning in this period, we don't have that anymore. Based on Deuteronomic ideas, that practice is scrapped. We don't have any more local altars. And that has a profound effect on the Israelite religion, on the Jewish religion, in a number of ways. The first one is it makes the temple even more centralized, even more of a centrally important part in the spiritual life of the Judean people. The other issue is it now raises a big question of what do we do with all these Levites? With all these Levites, all these Levitical priests out there that used to be in charge of maintaining local shrines and sanctuaries, and now they're not. Now there's nothing for them to do. Well, now logically, they can't always gather. You can't always gather in Jerusalem every Sabbath. So instead, what a lot of local communities started doing is gathering together briefly to read, from the scriptures and to pray. And this is the beginning of the prayer service, as it's sometimes called, as a model of worship. And to us as modern folks with, with the mass and everything, that's very much a prayer service in terms of its, in terms of the fact that we're, praying, and with the exception of, the Eucharist, there's really not we're not sacrificing animals in the middle of, of the church. And to us, it may seem odd to think of this as an innovation, but remember, in the ancient world, that was not the norm. Both the Israelites and their pagan neighbors, if you were gathering for a worship event, it usually involved the killing of and or burning of something, right? That was what you did. Yeah, that's what you gathered together to do. Sure, there might be some praying, there might be some hymn singing, but the idea of a service without a sacrifice, that doesn't really start to become the norm until this period. And remember, for the average Judean, this is what you're doing most of the time out of the year. You'd only travel to Jerusalem for major festivals like the Passover, or for major events such as the consecration of a firstborn son or things like that. You're not doing it for, every Sabbath. And then we deal with this prophecy of doom. So there's an account basically of when Josiah first finds this scroll of the law, he's looking at it and he's kind of terrified because he's looking at this long list of laws and commands and realizes that Judah isn't doing almost any of them. And he's freaking out because he's like, oh, well, what do I do? This would seem to suggest that we're not obeying almost any of God's laws. What do I do about that? So one of his advisors directs him to a woman that at the time is recognized as a prophet named Huldah. And we don't get any more details about Huldah other than that she is recognized as a prophet. And we don't know any of her prophecies. We don't, except for this one conversation. So King meets with Huldah And he gives her the scroll, this book of the law, and says, is this a legitimate book of the law? Is this an actual book of the law? And she reads it over and tells him, yes, it is. And Judah is doomed. Well, Josiah, he believes her on it's a legitimate book of the law, but he holds out hope that maybe if they reform, maybe if they turn back to God, maybe, just maybe, this doom can be averted. At the very least, he gives it the old college try. And there is some good news: the fall of Assyria and the rise of Babylon. So, some things you should know. So, brief note. This goes more into ancient world history than biblical history, but since we have this sudden fall of an empire and the rise of another empire, it's worth taking a note on what the heck happened. So, the Assyrians ruled through pure force of terror. Let's make something very plain about them. While their cities may have been beautiful and well constructed, there's no denying that Assyria ruled through brute force. They relied on terror tactics as a general policy, to massacring whole cities, enslaving large populations, other things that I'm not allowed to discuss here, but fill in the blanks yourself. Human flaying, skinning people alive, things like that. And this was done to terrify anyone of, look, this is what happens if you defy the king of Assyria. And for a long period of time, it worked. After all, if you put absolute terror into people and have the military force to back it up, you can maintain control. The problem comes when your military power slips. And that's exactly what happened when it came to the Assyrians. Their last few kings were weak. And as those kings grew personally weaker and weren't able to exercise the military power their predecessors had, those conquered subjects who were being brutalized began to rise up. And 2 of the conquered kingdoms that Assyria had subjugated rose up at once to overthrow their Assyrian overlords, Babylon and the Medes. And with this, the Assyrian Empire was ripped apart. Its cities were destroyed, and its empire was divided in 2, with the Medes taking the eastern portion of the empire and the Babylonians taking the western portion of its empire. This is the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the beginning of what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. We're going to return to the question of Babylon in a moment. But first, Judah's in trouble. Egypt. So Egypt's back in the picture again, and it's not good this time. So the pharaoh Necho invades Judah. Now, King Jehoahaz, I think it's Jehoahaz, is captured and taken prisoner to Egypt. He will remain a royal hostage for the rest of his life. He is ultimately succeeded by Eliakim, who the pharaoh personally appoints to be the successor. The successor, Eliakim, is renamed Jehoiakim and becomes king. Now, we know that the Judean monarch was captured in battle. We know Jehoahaz was captured in battle. We know Jehoiakim is made king by pharaonic dictate. What we don't know is exactly how far into Judah this invading Egyptian army actually got. Now, pause. I'm sure all of you or many of you have probably seen a certain action movie that claims that the Ark of the Covenant is in Egypt. This is actually the real world invasion that inspired that theory. There were a few archaeologists that had that theory that wondered, well, did Necho make it all the way to Jerusalem? And did he take treasure from there, including the Ark? As far as we can tell, there's no conclusive proof that this was done. But it remains an interesting question because Necho was part of the Nubian pharaohs. These were pharaohs that were not native Egyptian. They came from Nubia down in what's now like Ethiopia, Sudan, that kind of area. And they came north up the Nile, or down the Nile, rather, because now flows northward. Anyway, they came along the Nile, northward on the Nile, and became pharaohs. And there'd always been a great deal of cultural exchange between Nubia and Egypt anyhow. Now, eventually, they get pushed out, and questions remain now further. Did the Nubian pharaohs, if they did take the Ark with them, and again, there's no proof that they did. If they did take the Ark, would they have left it in Egypt, or would they have taken it south with them to Nubia, suggesting it might be in Ethiopia or Sudan today? We'll discuss that concept a little later when we talk about unanswered questions. All right, so Babylonian hegemony over Judah. So Jehoiakim becomes a vassal of Babylon. So basically, just as how Judah had owed tribute to Assyria, now they owe tribute to Babylon. Now, Jehoiakim, who is Jehoiakim's successor, he tries to rebel against Babylon and is he's given an execution order by Nebuchadnezzar himself, one of the major founding kings of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Zedekiah would later rebel against the Babylonians, who in turn destroy the city of Jerusalem. Now, a fun fact about Zedekiah's would-be rebellion. See, him and several other kings of vassal states, the Philistines included, basically had made a pact with Egypt, and there was going to be in it. And so they started a rebellion confident on Egyptian reinforcements. Egypt then welched on the deal and walked away, leaving the rest of them to their fate. And this is ultimately what causes the doom. Curiously, a prophet actually did tell Zedekiah not to do it, and Zedekiah ignored him. So the Babylonian exile. Next class, we are going to launch head on into the Babylonian exile, and we'll discuss what happened to the Israelites, the Judean people in Babylon, and we're going to talk about how it transforms their religion. So I hope you all enjoyed this class, and we'll talk again next week.